Hi, this is Phoenix, and I'm going to talk about ethics. I'm going to go into specifically the notion of what it means to be a good person, um, and we will see where the conversation takes us. So, I want to start off first with the question of what does it mean to be a good person, and I want to show why this is a very difficult subject. Personally, this is a very close subject to me. It's very important to me that I am a good person. And I mean that loosely as the kind of person that is dependable, trustworthy, has integrity, and is sincere, and is a person of virtue and character. Um, but it seems that the more that we think about these notions of you know, what does it mean to be a good person, the more that it seems that it's actually very hard to pin down what it means to be a good person. Um, and there's a lot of reasons for this. One of the reasons is because um, uh, the world is far from simple. Human motivations, the human psyche, the human condition are all very complex elements that make being a good person um, a very complicated matter. Um, and so those are some issues for sure. I want to talk specifically though about why sincerity is hard, and also why integrity is hard. And I want to do that by first starting off with talking about sincerity and talking about why sincerity is hard. So when we think of sincerity, we think of someone who truly means what they're saying. Um, and this seems very simple. This seems like a very simple virtue to live because basically this means that you're simply honest, and you stand by the things that you say and the like. Um, but I actually have noticed that in day-to-day life, this is actually very difficult um, to um, execute. It's difficult because it would seem that when you're a sincere person, it can make you a target, and so your sincerity becomes manipulated. Um, Sometimes it is also simply just hard to be a sincere person. It's hard to be honest about um, you know, the motivations and reasons behind what you're doing, because there's a lot of really complex factors that may play into our decisions that we may not even be aware of or take into account. Um, there's also the notion of flaws to focus on for sure. And, we could be the most sincere person in the world, but we still have flaws. And those flaws are going to prevent us from being sincere people and essentially staying true to the things that we say. And that can be very difficult. Now, in terms of integrity, I would say that integrity is hard um, because, um, again, like sincerity, it can get you into trouble for one thing, and uh, can just be it is fraught with certain issues that make it hard to execute in real life. And so I would define integrity as many things. One of the things you could say is the great quote of integrity is doing the right thing when no one is watching. Um, but integrity is also kind of sincerity, but it's more integrity in terms of action. So it's the idea of doing something. Um, so when you do something with integrity, you do that thing because uh, you have a conviction and you feel it's right, and there's no bias or prejudice or malintent involved. And so it kind of relates to honesty and that virtue and having integrity. And so if we go off that definition loosely, we start to think of some issues with integrity. One of them is simply hypocrisy. So it's very easy to fall into hypocrisy. So sometimes we're willing to sacrifice our integrity um, for more immediate rewards. Um, and many times being a person of integrity does not pay off. Um, it may pay off in terms of like, maybe you feel good about yourself to a degree, but then that can lead to self-righteousness, so it might not always be the best thing. But it would seem to me that in many times, and this is true of sincerity too, but with integrity there isn't a lot of payoff. And so it's very easy for us to slide into notions of hypocrisy and behaviors that are hypocritical. Another thing is simply pressure, and this ties into sincerity as well, because sincerity uh, um, can often be discouraged by people. So when you're sincere, people may see that as an unwanted characteristic, an unwanted trait. And just like integrity, they will eventually try to pressure you to become a different person, to not have integrity, to not try to do the right thing despite the circumstances and the like. And it's just very easy to fall into our environmental pressures and what our environment is telling us. And it's very hard to stand our own ground. Um, Now I want to talk real fast on related to these notes about the idea of character and what character entails and what it means to have character. And I would say generally character is something that gets overlooked a lot in society. Alistair McIntyre has this beautiful idea where he describes that the problem with the existentialists is they forgot about the importance of character, such which was propounded in the Aristotelian tradition, but the importance of character. And so character is just like the kind of person we are, and like those are the kind of choices we make because of our character. So if our character is good-natured, then we're going to tend to be nice to people. Um, and character isn't fixed; it's not deterministic. It's something that we try to cultivate. But essentially, the idea behind character is we want to cultivate that character to be something productive, but not even productive in a utilitarian sense, or simply uh, for utilitarian purposes, but also to cultivate character because um, we want to become a better person. And so, essentially, what we want to do is cultivate goodwill, good intentions, and good aspects of character, such as kindness, such as generosity, forgiveness, and those things. And I think those are important to keep in mind. And I think that the thing about character is that, as McIntyre says, we've taken it for granted, and we forget that it's important that we cultivate character. But this is kind of the difficulty is how hard it is to cultivate character. So there's environmental pressures that act on us all the time, cultural factors that act on us all the time, even internal factors, psychological factors that act on us. And they make it very hard for us to cultivate character. So there's many times where we're willing to compromise what we consider to be right in order to have some kind of immediate gain, for instance. But that is kind of a sacrifice of character. But the reason why it's hard to cultivate character, aside from pressures, is simply because it takes effort, and it takes a lot of effort that sometimes people aren't willing to work on, and so that can be very difficult. Um, and so that's something to keep in mind. Um, I'm gonna move further through this argument and talk about relativism and the role of relativism in this ethical idea of what it means to be a good person, and again, why it can be hard to be a good person. Um, so ethical relativism is defined as essentially any system of ethics is as good as any other system of ethics. So my system of ethics is as good as your system of ethics. Now, how this deals with being a good person is very interesting. So I'm going to start by talking about an example. So Jesus Christ is revered. He essentially spearheaded a religion. Well, not spearheaded. Because of him, a religion, Christianity, was created, and so he's considered a very good person, and exemplifying many virtues. Um, and yet Bertrand Russell, a very critical philosopher, thought that Jesus was actually a vindictive person. This is what we mean by relativism. So Jesus Christ, the epitome of what we would expect as as being a good person, is not seen as a good person to one person, which would be Bertrand Russell. And so, of course, it doesn't mean that this is right, but it's very hard when we start getting into this kind of territory because relationships in real life are a lot more messy. So, what one person may perceive to be a good action that they have done may actually not be a good action according to other people, or it may not be a good action objectively. I mean, it really doesn't matter how you, even socially, it doesn't matter how you look at it. It might still be a bad thing. Or conversely, the opposite can happen. Someone could do something bad, but society around them would perceive it as good. And so I'm pointing this out because this is another problem that flies in the face of trying to be a good person and trying to do the right thing. Because what happens is, while I wouldn't say that we live in an ethically relativist world where any system of ethics is as good as any other, I think there has to be, to some degree, an absolutist system of ethics that is like truly good and truly beneficial. I think that it's hard to get around our subjectivities. And this goes into a little bit of philosophy of mind, but we all have different subjective viewpoints on what is right and wrong. And this plays in our day-to-day life all the time. And so this can be very hard for a person who seeks to do the right thing because essentially it can become relative to other people's positions and stances. And so you might have an advocate who thinks that they're like completely doing the right thing by advocating for maybe someone with a mental illness or someone who is homeless or another vulnerable person. But they may actually be causing harm. And I think that's important, at least according to other people. Now, I'm not making a statement about the truth value of this claim. What the person is doing could be right. It could be wrong. It just depends. But regardless, the way that people perceive our actions, unfortunately, has more of a bearing on how we act than we would like to admit. I'm not going to go so far as to say that we're determined. I'm not going to take a deterministic stance that our actions are determined by environmental pressures. But I would say that this is one of the things that makes it hard to be a good person is this whole notion of relativism and how if someone thinks that what you've done is wrong and they can prevent you from doing something that you consider right, who wins out, it's very difficult to know. But essentially, it's a very relative position that makes it hard to make any meaningful judgments and to live a life of virtue. So I'm going to end with an interesting conclusion and kind of a heartfelt and anecdotal and personal conclusion. But the conclusion is that I feel like I essentially fell to be a good person. I read all the time to try to better my knowledge, and I study philosophy to try to better my rational thinking. I study religions to try to learn more about virtue, and even you could include the ancient Greeks, obviously, such as Plato. And I study them, and that's just one thing that I do to try to improve myself and become a better person with the self-criticism and the like, and improving myself to be a better person in society. But I feel like I failed to be a good person because essentially I've had to come to the conclusion that the world is very messy, the world is very gray, and obviously this isn't easy to live with, and this is probably an unfair conclusion to come to that I failed to be a good person, but it's important that I drive this point home because I think that is why I fell to be a person of virtue, because the world is so gray, because the world is so messy, because nothing is cut and dry, because I don't have the perfect system of ethics integrated into my mind and act accordingly. And that makes it really hard for someone who strives to be a person of virtue, who strives to be a good person. And so in that sense, though, I would say, in kind of an ironic spin, that this doesn't mean I'm going to give up with trying to be a good person, that I'm going to continue to try to strive to have virtue. And that if you struggle with the same kind of understanding that the world is very gray, then yeah, Anyway, this is Phoenix. Thanks.